So, welcome to lesson 4 of the ecology unit. On lesson 4, organisations of an ecosystem. You will see some of the spec details that go through some of the key definitions that we're going to focus on today. Specifically, we are going to be looking at feeding relationships and the relationships between animals and organisms that consume one another. So to begin with, first step would be just to give yourself a few minutes, pause the video, review your notes from previous lessons and have a go at the knowledge check questions on the next 2 pages just to see what you can recall from previous lessons studied on this unit. So pause the video now and have a go at that. Right, now you should have unpaused, so if you get a pen ready just to check your answers, mark them, correct them. Define abiotic. So abiotic factors are non-living. Define species. Species are organisms that can interbreed to produce fertile offspring, so offspring themselves that can reproduce. From our previous lesson, 3 examples of structural adaptations. So adaptations that animals have where they have a physical change or physical alteration to their body or mass. So for example, claws for hunting, camouflage for protection, and either a large or small surface area to volume ratio. 2 functional adaptations, so processes that organisms have adapted to be able to do in order to survive. Photosynthesis is 1, and producing venom or, for example, toxins is another. Behavioural adaptations, so how organisms have changed their behaviour in order to survive. Huddling together for warmth, think penguins. Pack hunting, think lions, for example, and courtship dances. So, specific dances to display an organism's reproductive prowess. What's the name of organisms adapted to live in extreme environments? They are called extremophiles. Then, if we turn over, define a community. So these are 2 or more populations living in the same geographical area. Define extinction. Total species loss. Then a couple of questions, just jog your memory from previous units. How do you calculate wave frequency? It's wave speed. Divide it by wavelength. And what are the 4 chemical bases that make up DNA? So the 4 chemical bases that make up DNA are, you might just need to know them as letters, A, T, C, and G, or adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. Right, I'm going to go over today's objectives. Identify feeding relationships within a community and describe experimental methods for investigating the population and distribution of species in an ecosystem. We're not going to focus so much on this one today because we're going to do that and look at that in lesson 5. So we're going to focus primarily on this one. Identifying feeding relationships within a community. So let's have a look at this text and just break it down and see if we can understand it based on what we've looked at so far. So within any community, different organisms rely on others for survival. So remember, communities, 2 or more populations, often different species living in the same geographical area, rely on others for their survival. What do we call that? We've come across that term earlier. Interdependence. Feeding relationships, in a nutshell, show what eats what? That is what a feeding relationship is, and can be shown in a simple food chain or a more complex food web. Several food chains interlinked. So a food web is food chains that are interlinked together. We'll look at more of that in a moment. All food chains start with a producer, an organism that makes their own food by using photosynthesis and the sun's energy. So producers are always at the start of a food chain, and they're usually plants or algae. Now, this food, glucose, is then used by the producer to grow and live. So glucose is made by photosynthesis, isn't it? It's used to grow and live. So for growth, glucose is needed because it combines with nitrates. It combines with nitrates from the soil, taken in by the roots, to make amino acids, which is what proteins are made out of. So if you grow, you've got more proteins, and those proteins are made out of amino acids. Right, and to live, one of our 7 life processes needed to be able to live is an R, for which you need energy, which you get from glucose. It's needed for respiration. Energy stored in the plant's tissue is called biomass and is transferred through other living organisms along the food chain as they consume and are consumed. Energy stored in the plant's tissue is called biomass. Now, what do we know that glucose is stored as in a plant? Glucose is stored as starch. So starch is a storage molecule for glucose, and it makes up a lot of the biomass of the plant. Now remember how you test for that. If you put a leaf into boiling water and then ethanol, and then you place iodine on it to show the presence of starch, the iodine goes black, doesn't it? If you remember that test. Then it's transferred through other living things along the food chain as they consume and are consumed. These are called trophic levels. So trophic levels is just another word for stages of a food chain. Then, organisms that consume producers are called primary consumers. If you think about these, if they're consuming plants, they are usually herbivores. And these in turn become prey and get eaten by secondary consumers, which are predators, which are often known to be, obviously, carnivores. The energy at the beginning of the food chain is limited, and much is used by each organism during their lives. Remember, each of these organisms does each of the steps from Mrs. Gren: movement, respiration, sensitivity, growth, reproduction, excretion, and nutrition. And that energy gets transferred to their surroundings. So there is always less energy to be transferred onto the next organism. That's why if you have a look at the food chain below, our apex predator, which is top of the food chain, the fewest in number. Why is it the fewest in number? Because there is less available energy for it. Less available energy for them. So therefore there are fewer of them. Now, you've got a food chain here, which details what's just been talked about up above. Got our producers, which are often our plants, and they make their own food. Our primary consumers are secondary, tertiary and quaternary consumers who eat other organisms. Or other living animals. Eat other living animals. And then down at the bottom here, we have these arrows. And these arrows show the direction of energy transfer. They show the direction of energy transfer. Now, I'll make sure that this YouTube video is embedded in the links below this video, but just spend now a bit of time, pause the video with the resources you've got, go to this link, and then watch it through and try and draw yourself just an annotated food chain to show an example of how energy moves through an ecosystem using the information on this video. So that is your next task. Pause the video, find this one, either in the comments below or using the resources you've been sent, and then draw yourself an annotated food chain to show how energy moves through an ecosystem. So do an example. Do an example using the information on the video. So pause the video and have a go at that, and then we will unpause and carry on. Right. Should have unpaused the video by now, so we will now move on to our next stage, which is looking at food webs. So, food webs show the interaction between organisms in an ecosystem. The arrows show the movement of energy from the producers through to the final consumers. Now, remember, food webs are simply interlinked food chains. Now, the reason why these exist is because organisms have more than one food source. So, for example, our killer whale here does not just live life eating penguins. He eats penguins, he eats leopard seals, he eats elephant seals, and they're all part of different food chains. So therefore, they have to be merged together into this food web because different consumers have more than one food source. And as we've said, the arrows show that energy goes between organisms when they are eaten. So when the killer whale eats the elephant seal doesn't get any of the energy that the killer whale has. All of the energy that is contained within the elephant seal, within its biomass, for example, goes to the killer whale. So it's the energy from the biomass. Now, have a look at the example below. So we've got this food web, and all we have to do is pick out different food chains from the food web. Now, if you have a look at the food web, we can identify the bottom of the food chains really easily. Phytoplankton and seaweed. These are our producers. These are our producers. So these will go in our producer boxes. Seaweed. Phytoplankton. And because phytoplankton has got two arrows coming off it, it's part of two different food chains. I'm going to put phytoplankton in here again. Now, seaweed has only got one food chain. One arrow going off it. What's it eaten by? It's eaten by a crab. The crab has one arrow going off it. What's the crab eaten by? It's eaten by a squid. Now the squid has 2 arrows off, so this food chain can go in 2 different directions. Let's say it goes up this way. Squid are eaten by penguins. And the penguin has 2 different arrows going off. What could we say? Penguins are eaten by killer whales. You have 1 food chain right there. Let's look at the phytoplankton. Phytoplankton go one way. It's eaten by the krill. The krill can be eaten by either fish or the blue whale. Now, let's say on this one, it's eaten by the blue whale. Now, does anything eat the blue whale? Are there any arrows that go off the blue whale? No, they're not. So that means this here is a shorter food chain. This is the end. This is the top, or our apex predator. So it's shorter than the other food chain. So we don't need these boxes. Then, have a look at the other way. So the phytoplankton can also be eaten by the zooplankton. The zooplankton has 1 arrow coming off it. It's eaten by the fish. Let's go the other way around for this one. The fish has 2 different arrows coming off it. Let's go down the small one. It's eaten by the seagull. And then also, the seagull is eaten by the leopard seal. So we've got several different examples here. Now, there's a key point here just to take you even further in your knowledge in this, and it's not necessarily GCSE content, it's A-level content, but it's worth bearing in mind as well, predators also don't just have to eat prey to have an effect on their populations and their actions. It's a key point this. If you just turn to your notes page, you might actually want to take a little bit of extra notes on this just to get your head around it. But what we call this fact when predators don't actually have an effect on just the population just through eating them is we can call this the non-consumptive effects of predators on their prey. And this was a proposition that came up by this biologist called Earl Werner in the 1990s and also late 2000s. Now, when you think about it, in the presence of predators, prey can do a couple of different things. They can move on to other areas, even if there's less food, to increase the chance of survival so they don't get eaten. And also, prey can spend more time hiding in sheltered habitats than feeding in the open. And this is to try and survive. Now, even without preying on them, the predators have already caused the prey to fail to thrive. Because if they've got less food, because they've moved to another area with less food, or they're spending more time being sheltered than feeding, their population number is going to drop, isn't it? So they're already having an effect on them. And I came up with some examples, such as what we call the green darner dragonfly larvae and their relationship with toad tadpoles. Now, whenever the dragonfly came around, the tadpoles became less active and swam to other parts of the tank in which the experiment occurs and metamorphosed into adult toads earlier and became smaller just to try and avoid the larvae. And this was just by being there. The larvae caused and changed the morphology, the shape, and also the behaviour of the toads. And then there's also another example that's worth thinking about, and this is called terrestrial non-consumptive effects. And this is a relationship between lynx, big cats, and roe deer. And the roe deer, in the environment where the lynx were, treated previous grazing areas as being out of bound because they feared being attacked by the lynx. And therefore their behaviour had also altered the ecosystem just to the predator being present. So some A-level knowledge there, just to give you this idea that predators also affect the population of prey just by being there, not even eating them. So I'll just run that through, and you can, if you want to, you can pause it and even make your own notes if you want to. So this is the first point: non-consumptive effects of predators on their prey. The second point was Werner's example of green darner dragonfly and their effects on toad tadpoles, causing them to change their morphology and behaviour just by being there. And then the third point: terrestrial non-consumptive effects, the relationship between the lynx and the roe deer, causing the roe deer to treat previous grazing areas out of bounds just because the lynx might be there. So if you want to go through those and even make your own notes, you can pause the video at various points and use that. Right, once you've done that, we go back to our example points here. Now, on the next page, I'm going to ask you to ignore this section because this section is going to be covered in lesson 5 and I'd rather not complicate things for you. And on the next page, I also want you to, page 35, I also want you to ignore this section as well. Have a look for me now, please, at this checkpoint question at the top of page 34. If I had a drink and then I tried to say something and it all came out wrong. If you want to, pause the video and have a go at it first, using some of that knowledge we've just talked about. If not, keep the video going and we'll go through the question itself now. Crabs are common prey of seals. Suggest and explain what would happen to the number of crabs if a local seal population was infected with a fatal virus. Now, suggest and explain. It's 3 marks. Suggest always implies what might happen. And the explain means how or why. So what might happen to the number of crabs if the seals are infected by a fatal virus and why? That's what the question is going to ask of you. So the first point is, if you've got seals who are dying off from a fatal virus, the crab population will do what? The crab population will increase. Why? Because they've got fewer seals preying on them. Now, if you've got fewer seals preying on them, what are the crabs more likely to do in order to increase their population? The crab's chance of reproducing and offspring surviving increases. It's as simple as that. So it gives you a model question there. Even if you weren't 100% sure on how it worked, that should hopefully explain it a little bit more to you now. Right. Once you've done that, as I've said, ignore the next couple of pages and have a little look at that. As I said, page 35. I'm not going to worry about for now. Page 36. Again, I think we're going to ignore this section because this comes up in lesson 5. So let's just ignore that section for now, please. And then finally, can you spend a few minutes having a look at the knowledge and application check questions for this lesson? Pause the video, go back over your notes, see what you can do, and then we will go through these together. And all I'm going to say is please ignore question 6, 7 and 8. Right, let's go through them. So, mean equals an average. Describe the role of a primary consumer and that is to eat producers. Trophic levels is another word for stages of a food chain or web. Complete. The arrows in a food chain represent the direction of energy transfer. And then give the name of the third feeding level in a food chain. So that would be, you've got the producer, you've got the primary consumer, that would be your secondary consumer. Right, and because these questions link to the content that actually I want you to focus on in lesson 5 instead, we're going to ignore those, and we're going to ignore those. Just to jog your memory from previous content, what is mass number? Mass number is the number of protons and neutrons per atom. And an endothermic reaction takes in energy from its surroundings. And then if we finish, if you want to have a little look at the extension activity, pause the video and have a go, and then we'll go through it together. So as it says, explain why a food chain has decreasing numbers of organisms in each trophic level. For example, why are there fewer eagles in the example compared to the number of grasshoppers? The answer is simply, there is less available energy for the eagle because other organisms have used it to complete life processes. So, e.g., Mrs. Gren. Right, well done, folks, and that is lesson 4.